really matters? That might be the most important question you can ask. So let's talk about it. Welcome to What Really Matters podcast, Everyday Spirituality with Karen Wyatt. Thanks for joining me here for another episode. Today I'm going to talk about learning how to be bully-proof. And what I mean by that is how to not ever be in a position of feeling like I'm being bullied by other people, but also specifically not bullying myself. I've been thinking a little bit about this, about the behavior that bullies use toward other people. And there are certain tactics that are often used for a bully to try to attack and to try to get dominance over another person. But then it occurred to me that these are just tactics of the ego that all of our egos use in order to try to establish dominance even within us, in order to retain power, in order to avoid being hurt. And so as I was looking at how to avoid being hurt by another person's bullying behavior, I realized I have to start with myself. And if I can become aware of my own ego and the tactics it uses towards me and towards others, that will go a long way toward protecting me from other people who try to use those same tactics, because oftentimes the reason that we're susceptible to someone's bullying is because we ourselves are wounded. We have a wounded ego that gets triggered by someone else's tactics. So this might sound roundabout a little bit, but I think it's most important that we start looking within ourselves at our own inner bully and thinking about how we sometimes beat ourselves up. And the more we can understand that and the more we can help ourselves heal from it, I think the more resilient and resistant we will be to other people's bullying behavior. Also, we'll be more likely to recognize it. So as I was thinking about some of the tactics that our wounded egos use, first of all, the ego tries to deny that anything wrong has been done, that a mistake has been made. The ego always wants to deny any accusation or any evidence of not being perfect. So the ego will instantly put up a wall rather than looking at that or thinking it through. So even the fact that we're talking about our egos can be bullies can trigger denial in each one of us. Well, no, that's not how I behave. That's not what happens within me. Our own wounded egos can be in that state of denying that there could be a problem or that there's anything to look at. Another part of this denial is also deflection, which means looking away from the source of the problem and trying to find something somewhere else that is causing the problem. So instead of saying, I've been carrying with me this wound of rejection since I was a little child, that's where all my pain is. Instead of looking at the rejection itself and the wound itself, the ego tends to deflect. It's too painful to go there. I don't want to go back to that memory and have to face that. It's too painful. So I'm going to deflect this issue to something that is much less uncomfortable for me. I'm going to tell myself that this feeling of rejection just came from the fact that I had a flat tire and wasn't able to go to my friend's party, or because the weather was bad that day. It's always trying to find an external cause that may have created the situation instead of looking more deeply at the pain. The next tactic is to project. And so this is similar to deflection, but it is projecting the cause of the trigger and the pain inside of me onto another person. Many times the wounded ego will accuse someone else of having the very wound that the ego is trying to protect. So it might be thinking of another person and saying, oh, they're just afraid of being rejected, obviously, when it's actually me who's afraid of being rejected. And this projection can turn into blame toward other people and a true blindness that causes us to think that other people are creating the difficulties we have in our lives and even the deep pain within us, instead of being able to look within and look at our own woundedness that we carry with us. Other tendencies of the ego are to amplify or exaggerate issues. So maybe a person says something very benign to us, like, oh, you're wearing a jacket today, I didn't bring one. And the ego distortion and amplification may cause us to turn that into some sort of criticism or an attack from the other person. And we might remember inaccurately that the other person made fun of us for being overprepared or overly worried about the weather by bringing along a coat. So in this way, the wounded ego hides behind this blame and criticism of another person and then amplifies the other person's words in memory to be far worse than they might have been. And the final tactic that the wounded ego, not that these are the only tactics, but as the ego escalates its self-protection mechanism here, the ego becomes a victim and begins to see itself as the victim of an attack by the other person. And so that's the extreme example of projecting onto someone else and amplifying what they have said or done, is to feel like a victim based on what another person has said. Now, the fact is, sometimes we are victims and there are abusive people in our lives, and it's really important that we learn how to have discernment and to recognize when someone truly abusive is in our space and our world, when they are causing us physical, emotional, or mental harm because of their aggressively abusive behavior, we need to take steps to protect ourselves, and we need to leave the relationship. We need to insist that that person get help, seek counseling. We need to take definitive steps in order to protect ourselves in those cases. And I'm not really talking about a case where another person is actually being abusive to us. I'm talking about times when our ego distortion may cause us to see something in our world differently than it really is, and to use it as a weapon or as ammunition toward another person, but also toward ourselves. So it's really our own behavior toward ourselves that I want to talk about. And we use these same tactics: denial, deflection, projection, amplification, and victimhood. We use the same tactics against ourselves. So we're going to step away from looking at how another person treats us to how we treat ourselves and how we view ourselves when things are not going well in our lives. When a mistake has happened or when something unfortunate happens in our lives, and how that can trigger our own wounded ego and we become our own bully. Our own wounded ego begins to beat up on us. So I wanted to mention those tactics regarding how the ego can behave, because we use them against ourselves. Our ego uses them against us. And again, I'm not talking about being with an abusive person in your life. I'm talking about using this information to help us stop abusing ourselves in our own minds mentally, and how we talk to and treat ourselves. So the other thing to understand about bullying is the statement you've probably heard before: hurt people hurt people. And this is true for the ego as well. Hurt egos hurt egos. So it is our wounded ego that rises up and causes more pain for us within ourselves. It is the wounded, hurt part of us that tends to create self-bullying inside of us. And it's so important that we remember that, because we want to step out of a vicious cycle of triggering our wounded ego, which then beats up on us, which then triggers more wounded ego, which beats up on us more. There's this vicious cycle of self-blame, and I've talked about this before. And the only way to step out of that cycle is to have compassion. And so when we remember, if I am beating up on myself, it's because I'm hurting. It's because some part of me is wounded and is hurting. And that part of me needs love and needs my compassion. And so it's really important that we begin to understand and recognize this dynamic within ourselves. When something triggers our woundedness, and it may be something outside of us that triggers it, but if there's nowhere outside of us that the wounded ego can go to protect itself or express itself, then the wounded ego may take it within and may make everything my fault, and may be finding self-blame, a reason to blame me for something that happened to me, a reason to feel shame and disappointment and to be angry within myself. So anything that happens that triggers the wound can lead to this bullying behavior by our own ego. I hope this is making sense to you. It may not make sense unless it has happened to you, but you might be able to look back and think of circumstances when you made a mistake, or you had some sort of a failure in your life, or something disappointing that happened, and that immediately within you, you felt this cascade of negative emotions that were all directed toward you, all of this self-blame and self-doubt and discomfort inside that prevented you perhaps from going out and making things better and fixing things or changing it or doing something differently. So this is the self-bullying behavior that I'm talking about. And the very first step is to be able to recognize it, just to be able to see that there is this wounded part of me that sometimes acts out and takes out its pain on me. And the wounded part of me hides and is disguised and isn't always recognizable. And very often we don't know for sure where it comes from. We can't remember what the wound is, or we're not clear about it. And that's why this takes a lot of work. It requires us, first of all, to recognize when we get triggered by certain events that happen and what it is that triggers us. And then to spend time with our triggers and thinking about it. Why would that matter to me? Where would that come from? Why am I sensitive about that? It may take some contemplation and journaling about these triggers in order to dig a little more deeply, to understand it, or to have memories come back. And here's a very simple example for me. In my case, I'm quite tall, and I grew to my current height when I was 12 years old over the course of one summer. And all of my height is in my legs. I have very long legs. And so as a 12-year-old, that first summer when I grew so many inches between the end of the school year and the beginning of the next school year, I became like a different person physically. And I was also very clumsy. I had these long legs I didn't know how to handle. And so I got teased by my brother and his friends for having such long legs and being so tall. Who knows why? Maybe it felt threatening to them that I was growing so fast and becoming so tall. But I was embarrassed and humiliated by my long legs and how clumsy I was, the difficulty I had just coordinating these two long legs that suddenly were there, that hadn't been there just 3 months before. So for all of my life since then, I've been sensitive about the fact that I'm tall and embarrassed by it. to be honest. When someone says, "Oh my goodness, you're tall, I didn't realize that," immediately inside of me, this shame spiral gets triggered, and I feel embarrassed, and I feel like they're telling me that I'm awkward or clumsy, or I don't look normal, or there's something wrong with me. I go into this shame spiral, and all it takes is for someone to notice that I'm tall, and maybe someone who'd only seen me on Zoom and had no idea how tall I am, and they just comment on it because it's interesting, that becomes a wounding, triggering comment to me. It's not their fault. There's nothing wrong with mentioning, "Oh my goodness, you're so tall, I didn't realize that." There's nothing wrong with saying that. But it's my trigger that comes from my wound. So that's one example of what I'm talking about. And the other person didn't wound me. I have a wound, and then my bullying ego beats up on me about it. Like, "You shouldn't have worn these shoes because they have taller heels, and now you look even taller than usual. You should have done something different with your hair. You should have," my inner bully starts criticizing me for perhaps looking even taller. And this is the type of cycle that I'm talking about. And of course, it's up to you to figure out, what are your triggers? What are the scenarios? What are the simple things that actually lead you into a shame spiral like this? And where does your own inner bully get triggered? So what can we do about this? The most important thing, as I was saying already, is to begin to recognize when you're triggered, to begin to see like, whoa, oh my goodness, I have all these negative emotions arising in me right now. That means I'm triggered. And to also see, when I get triggered, that's an opportunity for me to learn something more about myself, and also to heal an old wound within me. So it's not a bad thing to be triggered. It's actually an opportunity and a chance to heal. So it's good to shift our mindset about that, and to not want to avoid being triggered, but to be able to see being triggered is a way to heal myself, a way to get more information about what's going on inside of me. And that's a good thing. When I'm offered these opportunities, it means I'm ready to heal. I'm ready to get stronger and to grow more. So change how we think about being triggered in the first place. And that will help us spend a little more time thinking about the trigger. Because I've mentioned the shame spiral before. The moment you're triggered and you start thinking negative thoughts about yourself, you become ashamed of yourself for thinking negative thoughts. And that is what contributes and keeps the shame spiral cycling around and around. So there's no shame in being triggered. There's no shame in having negative thoughts about yourself. And it's actually a good thing. And it's an opportunity to learn something new. So change your mindset about being triggered. Then you can sit down and notice, like, wow, what exactly was it that made this happen? What was it? I was feeling pretty good today. And then someone said one thing, and it shifted everything inside of me, and I went into a shame spiral. It's so great if you can remember to write down the exact words the other person said, and what you were doing, what were you wearing, what was happening in that moment, because there are little keys within all of those details that will help you connect with your original wound. And so for me, it might be something, it might be certain words that were used that resemble how I was teased when I was younger for being tall and gangly. It might be a certain word. It might be the way it was said or the situation in which it was said that caused that trigger to go off. So the more you observe the triggers when they happen, don't judge them, actually be grateful, embrace them, welcome the trigger, and then remember the details, write them down if you can, because it's such a good thing to journal about and think through. The more you pay attention to the triggers, the more memories may begin to come back to you of specific times, perhaps the first time you were ever wounded in this way. about this particular subject, it may come back to you. You may see it really clearly, and that will really help you delve into it and reframe it and begin to heal it within yourself. So the more you look at it, the more you're able to study it, the more likely you are to have memories return and to have more and more of this wound surface for you so that you can work on it and heal it. Now, it hurts. It hurts to look at our wounds. There's no question about that, and it's work. But this is such an important step as we try to grow spiritually and become our best selves. So it's necessary and really important work that we do. And when I talk about learning not to bully yourself, it's actually to stop that shame spiral from happening, to stop the self-criticism from happening. Because again, that is all just it's a deflection tactic. It's your ego keeping you from looking at the wound, blaming you for the shoes you wore, for the way you did your hair, blaming you for something else so that you don't have to actually go back and feel the original wound that is the cause of this trigger. So understand, oh, thank you, ego. You're just trying to protect me from that painful wound. But you know what? In order to grow and become a better person, I need to go through some of this pain. I need to relive some of this. The truth is, when you do start exploring wounds, oftentimes it doesn't hurt as much as you imagine that it will. Oftentimes because you're looking back at a wounding experience that might have happened when you were a child, but you're now an adult. You've lived a lot more years and had a lot more experiences. And so that original wound will not feel the same to you now as it did when it originally happened. You may be able to look at it with different context and through different eyes. And so the truth is, we don't have to fear our old wounds or looking at them again. And I do understand some of us are carrying horrific, terrible wounds. Those wounds may require us to be in therapy with a counselor who can guide us and be with us as we explore them. And again, I'm not talking about some of the wounds that have occurred through horrific abuses. I'm talking more about the everyday wounds that we give to ourselves, our friends, our siblings, our parents, the everyday wounds that happen just in the process of us being who we are and growing up. And those wounds, though, still get retained within us and protected by our egos and shielded. And they can still cause us to get triggered. So again, be able to discern and differentiate in your mind. If you've been wounded by an abusive parent or any other abusive person in your life, and you are carrying deep, serious trauma within you, you need a therapist to help you explore those wounds. These wounds of someone teasing you because your legs grew too fast, these are wounds that you can probably look at yourself, but you have to have the discernment to understand when it's deeper and more serious than that and when you need help. So please don't think that I'm saying you should just be able to heal serious traumatic abuse on your own in your life. I'm really only talking about the everyday types of wounds that we may have encountered just in being children and being adolescents in our lives. So once you begin to recognize the times you get triggered, you begin to understand what it is that triggers you, you get clues as to the original wounding event that happened. And that's where you can spend a little bit of time trying to understand it. Why did this happen? What was going on with the other person? Why did they treat me that way? What might they have been feeling? The more you can bring compassion into the whole scenario, compassion for yourself at the time, and even compassion for the other person, or at least a recognition that person somehow was also triggered for them to say something hurtful to you. Something was hurtful or frightening to them that they would treat you in that way. And if you can, in a sense, let the other person go, because you can't fix them. You can't go back and fix or change them. You can only change you. The more you have an understanding about how or why the situation happened, the more you're able to soothe yourself and say, you know what, like, that person, that's how they behaved. My ability, I can't change that. I can't change the fact that they said that to me. I can only look at my own hurt, and I can go back now and saying, hey, that wasn't nice. That wasn't a good thing that happened. But I'm not going to keep hurting myself over this very same wound. I would like to heal this wound so that it doesn't become ammunition that my own ego can use against me in a shame spiral. I would like to heal what has been hurt inside of me. And that's where we may have to get creative as we look at ways to heal ourselves. And I can say, apparently, I haven't fully healed this, I guess it seems kind of a silly wound about growing so tall in one summer and feeling embarrassed by the changes in my body, because it literally happened to me not too long ago when I met someone in public, and she told me later about having a conversation with someone else about how she had no idea how tall I was. And the other person said the same thing, like, yeah, I had no idea. I couldn't tell how tall she was. I didn't know that about her. And the thought that they were talking about my height, which could have been out of admiration, could have been a positive thing that they were praising, except I couldn't see it that way. The fact that I got triggered at this stage in my life about being tall tells me, oh my goodness, there's still a little wound there. That's something I need to go back and look at again and heal. And so journaling about it, reflecting on the advantages of being tall and how much I've really enjoyed and benefited from being a tall person in my life. And that's a helpful way to start to heal that, and even to understand, why would someone else be fixated on how tall I am? Why would it matter to someone else? I don't know for sure, but it's okay. If they meant it in a negative way, I don't need to receive that. I don't need that. And I certainly don't need to beat myself up or to use someone else's comments or someone else's feelings toward me as a way of hurting myself even more. I don't need to do that. So I can use it as a positive way to heal the old wound, and then also protect myself from my own self-bullying. And we'll find out if the work I have done on that makes a difference, because the next time someone mentions how tall I am, we'll see what happens. We'll see what triggers are still there and how I respond to it and what I feel inside. What I do know is that the shame spiral I have inside of me is getting better. I'm much less likely to spin off into this endless cycle of blaming myself for something that I can't control, and then blaming myself for blaming myself, and blaming myself for blaming myself for blaming myself. That's the shame cycle I'm talking about. So I hope that you will take some time to think about your own triggers, and also to look at whether or not you have some wounded parts of your ego that sometimes bully you. And what I'm sure of is the more we heal our own woundedness, the more we learn to not bully ourselves, the safer we will be around other people who practice bullying behaviors toward us. The more resilient we'll be, and the better we'll be able to resist that, and even to know how do I protect myself, or how do I choose to respond in this moment. So those are some tools I'm working on right now, along with so many other things. And I hope that's helpful to you in some way or another. Remember, you can go to eoluniversity.com/support and find ways you can help support this podcast and End of Life University to keep these podcasts on the air. And until the next time we're together, remember that we're here for love. So face your fear and your triggers. Be ready for whatever life brings you next, and love each and every moment of your precious life. Bye-bye.